Díomh Cathal an seoibh chur an banachtaí ó ardbhreathnach chuid gach duine í London agus sná háiteanna eile a bhfuil tú ag éisteacht. Hello from Ardbhreathnach to everyone in Bloomsbury and to everyone tuning into this year's Teaching and Learning Conference remotely. I hope wherever you are, you're keeping safe and well. Today, I'd like to talk to you about the role of nature in human identity. I'm recording this presentation at my little homestead in the west of Ireland, where I've spent the last week digging out old floors in my cottage and cutting back weeds. It's beautiful over here, and the work is a pleasure. But this is not going to be a presentation on the beauty of the natural world, nor is it going to be a clarion call to address any perceived immorality in our treatment of the planet. These few words, rather, seek to address what I perceive to be a deficiency in our thinking when it comes to the area of human identity. A deficiency that has repercussions for the planet as well as for all of us who live upon it. The modern period in terms of European philosophy begins with Descartes and his famous line, cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. We are told that Descartes took himself off to be on his own, and after a period of intense introspection, he came up with this line. The European Enlightenment, at least initially, sprang from this idea that our existence is based on our capacity to think. Scholars, particularly recent scholars, have found much to criticise in Descartes' cogito. Often they zone in, justifiably, on the disembodied notion of the thinking human, divorced from the material. In fact, Sir Ken Robinson beautifully described this in his greatly commended TED Talk, where he spoke about academics seeing their bodies as nothing more than machines to carry their brains from one meeting to the next. I don't want to address the split between the material and the mental in this presentation. It's enough to acknowledge just that it exists as a motif in European thinking. But I do want to address the nature of the solitariness of Descartes' thinking environment. And I want to address this because I think it points towards where the real deficiency in Western thinking lies, and that is the insulated human ego, unable to see the connections which have the potential to reveal some really profound lessons about human life. Now, I'm not attacking solitude, and that's important to say. In fact, I'm a great fan of solitude. I am taking a swipe, however, at the abstractions that flow from the mental processes of Enlightenment thinking which claims to be universal, but which is divorced from the experience of non-Europeans, divorced also from our senses, and divorced from the complexity of the external world. The kind of thinking, in other words, that went on in that little cabin where Descartes first articulated that famous and influential line, I think, therefore I am. The repercussions of such a judgment on the European Enlightenment, and indeed on its child, the so-called Western world, are far-reaching. The Polish philosopher Zygmunt Bauman has particularly interesting things to say on the Enlightenment's habit of creating scapegoats and enemies. In other words, its habit of creating others whom it condemns and excludes. This is an important thing to bear in mind when we ask the question, who do we want to be? European thinking has a habit of answering this by identifying who cannot belong. As a question, who I am has historically been answered in Europe by pointing towards the people I am not. Painful lessons emerged from this, lessons which sadly we don't seem to have learned. This is going to sound very familiar to those of you involved in articulating our values and mission as an institute a few years ago. Underpinning a lot of that work was a belief in the importance of nourishing our identity with the fruits that come from relationships with the world beyond us, with the world beyond self, an approach which was inspired by the French philosopher Emmanuel Levinas and his notion of alterity. Alterity, Levinas defines as a relentless attentiveness to the otherness of the other, and an openness to be transformed by that other. What an antidote to the limitations of Western exclusiveness. If the shadow of the Enlightenment is this preoccupation with the self to the exclusion of the other, then nature points towards some important ideas to restore some balance. And that's why I've entitled this presentation, Nature as First Teacher. Sitting here in my dilapidated cottage with the summer winds of the Atlantic Ocean making their way across the land, I'm not trying to make any of you jealous at all, but I've been thinking about some of these ideas, and I offer them today as provocations, perhaps. Provocations to temper the question, who do we want to be? So here are my top 5 nature-inspired antidotes to the limitations of Western thinking. 1. It may be great being a self, but we're all going to die. What a pin to burst the bubble of Enlightenment self-inflation. Nature teaches us this daily in the realms of plants and animals. The length of a life may vary, but in the great scheme of things, individuals don't last for very long. And far from provoking a sense of sadness or despair, this insight has the capacity to encourage a way of life that is rooted very much in the present, a way of life that wants to live all that is to be lived. The second lesson that nature may teach us in relation to bursting that Enlightenment bubble is that although we may be going to die, and we have these lives to live before all that happens, that in the midst of that life, nature nurtures complexity, not sameness. The thistle grows right beside the buttercup just outside my window, and neither seems to suffer from the desire to be anything other than what they are. There's no regulator here telling the thistle to be more like the buttercup, and certainly not telling the buttercup to be more like the thistle. Nature, in this sense, is a great prophet of diversity. Thirdly, nature doesn't seem to give a shite about how I am feeling, so why should I? Nature does not provide a reaction to my thoughts and feelings. It simply is what it is, and for this reason it is very good company. So much of our anxiety in the modern world seems to come from believing the thoughts and feelings that come into our heads and identifying with these. And maybe we could learn from nature to take these things less seriously and to question the drama around our own and other people's reactions to them. Fourthly, we may experience nature locally, but there is a universal quality to it. This part of Western Ireland is a dark sky region, so the stars at night are seen in particularly bright form. I couldn't help thinking of the recent Commonwealth Women's Entrepreneurship Summit while lying under the canopy of those stars the other evening. Women from all corners of the earth, using their knowledge and local wisdom, sometimes stretching back thousands of years, to respond to the needs of their communities and economies. The thought struck me that beneath the canopy of the stars, we are all different, but sheltered equally nonetheless. 5, at its most sublime, nature can be experienced without separation. The great artists and writers of Africa and Asia, the Americas, Europe and the Middle East all testify to this. The lines of distinction disappear and a sense of belonging emerges, which is tight and reassuring. The Irish poet Áine Keenan grasped this beautifully in her verse, "Oh, to be in human nature. Plains of people everywhere, spacious skies of brokenness, deep blue seas of those who care. To be at one with mountains too, of bliss and joy and sharing, walking valleys of the great unknown, with hope and trust and daring." So that's it from me, really. I wanted to throw these ideas into the mix of the conference because I think we have to continually remind ourselves of what tends to get excluded in higher education in Britain. Not just people, but the natural world also. And we have to remind ourselves of the architecture of education, which the European Enlightenment continues to hold. An architecture that finds it easy, it can be argued, to snare and degrade the voices and insights of those coming from very different starting points. So enjoy your lunch, and I'll look forward to seeing you all next month. In the meantime, Slán agus Banach live, go léir.